This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and today, just like any other day, I'm joined here in the studio by my trusted co-host, Dalia Shendlin. Hello, Dalia, and welcome back.
Hello, and thank you.
Our guest today is a lecturer in law at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom. He specializes in human rights law and migration issues, among many, many other things, and we're here to discuss these fields of expertise in an Israeli context. Dr. Ruvi Ziegler, hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, Gilad. Hello, Dalia. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So we wanted to start by asking you about some of the research that you've done on the issue of migrants, which are sometimes called asylum seekers, sometimes called infiltrators in Israel. It's been a big issue over the last maybe 10 years. I want to understand, maybe you can explain for us, why is this seen as such an unusual kind of phenomenon? It's not the first time that Israel's had waves of immigrants, of course, and it's certainly not the first time Israel's dealt with waves of immigrants who are not part of the Jewish Aliyah vision, right? We remember providing shelter for Vietnamese boat people in the 1970s. Why has the state, as your material shows, been sort of taken aback by the wave of African migrants coming from Sudan and Eritrea in the late 2000s?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, obviously. And I mean, I think to put this in context, I think it's interesting to recall that Israel was, or various Israeli functionaries, as you were quite instrumental in the drafting of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, which is the main international document that sets the definition of a refugee under international law and the consequences that follow from that definition. A convention that's now been signed by 147 states, and Israel was, if I'm not mistaken, either the 10th or 11th state to have signed and then consequently ratified that treaty back in 1954. Now, what Israel has never done since then is incorporated that treaty into Israeli law. And because Israel was previously a mandate territory, it means Israel has followed the British approach to international law, which means it's a quote-unquote dualist approach. It means that you need for the Refugee Convention to have a direct effect in Israeli law, you would have needed a law passed by the Israeli parliament for that to occur. And that has never happened. And you're entirely right to recall the occasion of one boat from Vietnam in the 1970s and the occasion, one could add, of one plane from Bosnia and the occasion of another plane from Kosovo. But these were all ad hoc government policy-based decisions for a variety of reasons, some of them probably quite notable and noble, to bring those specific groups of people on a rather kind of planned basis to Israel. I think what has happened in the 2000s, or as it were, from the mid-2000s onwards, is a fairly large number. We can talk later about numbers, not necessarily large comparatively, even compared with other OECD or developed states, global north states, but certainly not compared with the general region. But nonetheless, numbers of people who have come in uninvited, no plan was in place, and indeed, as a result, no legal structure was in place to handle those, hence also the different terminology, which I'm sure, will return to.
So when they actually started arriving in large numbers, and I think that from what you say, the main issue here is the fact that we were to some degree overwhelmed by the numbers of people who came here, and therefore that provided for Israel's inability to deal with them in a certain way. So what was really the legal situation, the legal framework at the time? I mean, you said that there were conventions that were never ratified, so it was like one big legal void that had to be addressed, and therefore the government had to address it.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I would say we were perceived to be overwhelmed. I mean, let's put that qualifier. But
overwhelmed
but
numerically, you mean?
Yes. I mean, but in the sense that these were a large number. I mean, it's not as if, as you've rightly mentioned, Darius rightly mentioned earlier, it's not as if Israel has had no experience in absorbing large number of people in short periods of time. So it wasn't being overwhelmed in the technical sense. It was overwhelmed in a different
but
sense.
it was more than one boat or one plane.
Sure.
Yeah,
No,
we were talking about tens of thousands of people.
Of course. And I think what has happened then is Israel suddenly saw a wave of people who were clearly not work migrants, because Israel has had an experience with having bilateral and other agreements of bringing in work migrants. There were also not Palestinians, neither Palestinian refugees, no Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza who come in to work for a day or two. These were people who've come in, and it was fairly, I think, evident from early on that they're not going back immediately, that it's not possible for Israel to send them back immediately. In the case of Sudan, partly because Sudan is defined under Israeli law, has been defined at that point as well as an enemy state. Israel has no diplomatic relations. And with Eritrea, one should credit the state for saying actually consistently that Israel's policy is not to return people forcibly to Eritrea. And that has been the policy at that point in time. And so you're faced with a situation where practically you have no structure under Israeli law that defines a refugee, defines the process for seeking asylum, defines the situation and the status of somebody who is not given refugee status, but also cannot be sent back to the country of origin. All of these were absent, still are absent from general primary Israeli legislation. And that is the case notwithstanding the international obligation. So you could have envisioned a situation where Israel would have these structures under Israeli law, notwithstanding the question whether it signs international treaties or not. It didn't have them at the time, arguably because nobody has forecasted, such large numbers of people wanting to come to Israel in the 50s or 60s, or even 70s and 80s. But one might argue there's a bigger agenda in place.
It sounds like you really want to tell us about that, but I think we need to back up and just understand when we keep talking about being overwhelmed, what are the numbers we're talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, and also I think it's important to point out that this started happening in the mid and late 2000s. So 10 years have gone by.
Sure.
What has the state done in that time to try to clarify this situation?
So I think there are a few things to be made here. I think, a few points rather. I think there was a particular conflation of facts that have led to a fairly large number of people entering in specific years. So the fall of Mubarak in Egypt, combined with the collapse of the agreement between the EU and the Libyan authorities under Gaddafi, which has changed the dynamics of travel from North Africa to Southern Europe, combined with the genocide in Darfur, combined with an increase in the tension between Eritrea and Ethiopia militarily. All of these...
And to some extent, the war between Sudan and South Sudan?
Sure. And all of these together have led in particularly 2010 and 11 to a large number of people entering Israel. At the height, in about the middle of 2012, you were talking about 60,000 quote-unquote infiltrators or asylum seekers from primarily Sudan and Eritrea, 90-something% of them residing in Israel at that point in time.
So that's a total number.
Yeah, and that is a lower number today, right? But that was the total number at that time, at the height of Israeli policy. And the additional factor that needs to be put into the equation, I think for fairness, but also for completeness, is that at the time there was still no full physical barrier between Israel and Egypt. So after the peace agreement, actually the border between Israel and Egypt was partly available for crossings and was crossed for a variety of reasons, but not for seeking asylum up to 2005 or 6.
So these people came into Israel overland?
They came into Israel almost exclusively overland, almost exclusively trafficked via the Sinai Desert.
Often going through horrible things.
Often even if they weren't already quite scarred by their experiences in the countries of origin, that path to Israel was scarring for a large number of them. And Israel, and I think there was a sense that Israel was being overwhelmed in the conceptual perception that that we can't stop it, bar a physical barrier, which is why I think there's actually a point to be made about understanding rather than justifying some of the initial policies that were put in place in 2011-12, but I think having far less understanding for policies of that sort continuing after 2012, because under the Ministry of Interior's own data, the numbers of people who have entered Israel, and I can quote, since 2012, since the end of 2012, we're talking about in total something like 500 people in 4 years, and about 20,000 people have left voluntarily with very large quotation marks.
Right.
Right.
And explain to us why that major drop in intake of people. It's because Israel has taken new policies since then. Can you describe those?
Well, so I think that so there's obviously that is part of the debate, right? So Israel, I would argue that there is now a physical barrier, and so it's very difficult to enter Israel. Israel's direct argument on this point is that it has put in place policies with the explicit aim of deterring new people from coming in. It's also made this as an argument that it perceives to have been a legitimate aim in pursuing policies of detention, primarily of asylum seekers. That policy, or quote-unquote infiltrators under Israeli law, which one should kind of add a caveat here or a footnote here, that legislation that is in place is legislation that was dormant since 1954 and was resurrected in 2012. This is legislation that was initially in place to be able to criminally sanction Palestinians who would come in as fedayeen from the neighboring states following the 48 war. So this was, it was using a criminal law, quote-unquote, counter-terrorism measure to address unwanted entrance by asylum seekers. And there were 3 iterations of Israeli Supreme Court judgments striking down Israeli Knesset legislation, primary legislation. So 3 out of, if I'm not mistaken, 14 or 15 times in total that the Israeli parliament has passed legislation and the Supreme Court has struck it down by judicial review. And the first time, to my knowledge, where the same issue has come before the court again, and the court has struck it down again based on its unconstitutionality. But
First issue ever in
Israel's history.
Legal history.
And I think
for all the talk about judicial review and how dangerous it is to Israeli society, it's not actually used very often.
Yes. And I think the reason it was used here is there was a sense that it was used to curb what is a very fundamental basic right, which is the right to liberty, and not to be deprived of that liberty arbitrarily, and that it was used primarily as a means of deterrence against other people coming in with a view to those who are already here actually not being deportable, which is something the state now admits.
Can you spend some more time on that last thing that you said about the fact that they're not being deportable? You said that Sudan was an enemy state, and here the situation is pretty straightforward. But in Eritrea's case, was it because Israel saw what's going on in Eritrea and said it is morally wrong to send these people back to where they came from?
Or against international law if their life is being threatened in Eritrea?
In a way, one wishes to have been a fly on the wall in internal discussions in the Ministry of Justice on this point, because it's really, I mean, you're asking of an entirely valid question, and one that the government is refusing to directly answer. I mean, the government's policy is not to forcibly return people to Eritrea. It has been consistently so. It doesn't then translate it to recognizing Eritreans as refugees, or
and granting them asylum
with the accompanying humanitarian rights of asylum seekers. So it won't grant them that.
Indeed. And as you rightly note, it's not just that Israel has diplomatic relations; it actually has pretty strong ties on a variety of matters, some of which are disclosed and others are not, which involve cooperation that are derived from its strategic location, the Horn of Africa. So, which is why one couldn't possibly say that Israel is not aware of what happens in Eritrea, because there are even flights to Eritrea. It's quite a direct link. So I think the fact that Israel doesn't send people forcibly back to Eritrea actually speaks volume in that
It's sort
context.
of an admission, but not an admission. And I just want to remind our readers that one of your papers is called "In the Land of Hidden Legislation Aims."
Yeah.
In other words, you're saying that the legislation tries to accomplish something but doesn't want to actually say what it's trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's So if we zoom out a little bit, I think there's a sense in which Israel, and you brought international law, and I obviously started with international law. I think Israel is certainly not trying to say that we disregard our international obligation. It's trying to suggest two things. A, that generally speaking, the sorts of people who have come here are not asylum seekers, and more significantly, or not refugees rather, and more significantly, that because of Israel's unique circumstances, and that's one of the points I made in one of the articles, that the Refugee Convention needs to get a different interpretation in Israel than it gets in other Western developed countries because we are in the neighborhood we're in and we face the dangers we do. Now, that actually, to me, is a more fundamental point than the other ones because it's trying to suggest that we can have our cake and eat it, to borrow Boris Johnson's phrase.
So what does it mean in practice? And also, let me continue that question in asking you, what do you think would be a solution that would satisfy the court as constitutional and would bring some end to the plight of the tens of thousands of people who are in legal limbo, as we just heard?
I think we're talking about 45,000 now.
Yeah. Well, so I think the current data is just over 40,000 actually, because there have been very, very many people who have left, quote unquote, as I said, voluntarily. I can talk about this in a bit, but I think so. So there are a few points to be made here. Eritreans seek asylum in other countries as well, right? So we have comparative data. This is not a random country in Africa where people come to Israel from and seek asylum. They are the third largest group of people seeking asylum in the United Kingdom. They're one of the countries that has the highest recognition rate across the European Union, over 80%. So and in Israel, the percentage of recognition is minuscule.
So you're saying, I just want to make sure our listeners understand. So that you're saying that of the portion of people who submit an application to be recognized as refugees in other European countries, 80% of them are recognized. In Israel, it's somewhere way below 1%.
It's a minuscule number. And that goes back to my earlier point about Israel applying a different interpretation of the Refugee Convention than other countries do. Now, that is then coupled with the sense that Israel says, on the one hand, we're not going to send them back. On the other hand, we're not going to recognize them as refugees. And then on a third of sort hand, we're not going to give them a status, which, for instance, exists in the European Union and other countries, of subsidiary protection. So you could say, well, our interpretation of the Refugee Convention doesn't entitle you to status, but we recognize you cannot go back. You're here. And so it means you need some sort of another status that would give you a legal right to work, that would give you a legal entitlement for welfare and other services. And
does the state give them that?
It doesn't.
No.
And as you've said, some of them have now been in Israel for 7, 8, 9 years. They're not going anywhere. They now may have children in school, and they are in this legal limbo. It is indeed a legal limbo.
So what about those who voluntarily, quote unquote, went back?
So what Israel has offered consistently, again, for several years now, is an incentive for people to leave for a third state, which it refuses to identify. So these are referred to in a case as countries R and countries U, namely Rwanda and Uganda, which also happen to be two of the countries
very discreet.
Thinly veiled.
Two of the countries that Netanyahu visited in July this year.
As part of his Africa tour.
And the argument is that this was indeed part of the agenda. And the problem is that Israel refuses to disclose those third country agreements, which, if you analogize it, it's not the only Western countries that tries to reach agreements with other countries to try and, as you were, offload some of its disproportionate burden, the non-existent disproportionate burden in international terms. Australia does similar things. The EU now does this with Turkey. The difference is that those other agreements are out in the open and can be scrutinized.
So why is Israel so worried about exposing these agreements? And when you say that they're not revealed, do you mean that they offer any particular asylum seeker the option of going to a third country, but they won't tell that person which country they're going to be sent to?
Exactly. So there is, the Israeli court has been issued with a confidentiality document signed by the Prime Minister saying that it will harm Israel's foreign relations to disclose those agreements. Now, why it would harm those foreign relations? your guess is as good as mine.
So what do you think, the bottom line now, we're quickly running out of time and we'll have to wrap up soon. What do you think would be the ideal solution legally, something that would satisfy the court as constitutional, would satisfy the population as adequately addressing the problem and give the government the political peace of mind that it seeks?
And maybe let's also add to that, can there be a moral dimension to it as well? Should there be, and what would it be?
Right. So I mean, I think the first point I would make is, I think the government should have the political courage to say, there was an open border, we've closed it. The numbers, to present the numbers and say the numbers have actually dwindled and there are no new people coming in. We have 40,000 people here. They're not going anywhere. We are also signatories to the Refugee Convention. It's time for us to legislate, to have in primary legislation a scheme for both recognizing refugees, but also for having subsidiary protection for those who are not granted refugee status and can go back. And I think the moral dimension is quite evident for a country where there were quite a lot of people who were denied asylum in other countries based on a combination of economic, demographic, and security arguments. And so I think without too much hyperbole, I think that must be in the back of people's minds when they think about Israel's refugee law obligations as well.
All right, Dr. Ruvi Ziegler, a lecturer in law at the University of Reading and a specialist in human rights and migration issues. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Dalia, and Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and also to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast and many more where it came from, just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can follow me, Gilad Halpern, and Dalia Shendlin on Twitter, and don't hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
היום יום הולדת, תראי יש פה סוד ישן חדש, לפרוס את הלחם, לגעת במשהו קצת מושלם, כבר אמצע הלילה, חשבתי אולי כדאי לישון, אבל משהו תקוע